Welcome to the Ultimate PvP Settings Guide. I'm going to put timestamps in the description so that you can skip through to whatever setting you're looking for. Let's just jump straight into it. Starting with keyboard and mouse, I'm not going to go through controller, but in terms of keyboard and mouse, you can apply anything that I say in this regard to controller settings as well. Most of these you want to leave on default, first of all. Pretty much all of these are all good. Auto move is helpful sometimes, but it's not an essential PvP useful button, but I do have it set to the default, which is pause, and occasionally I'll use that if I want to just walk in a certain direction while I go grab some food or something. Interact and secondary interact, these are important keybinds. You need to be able to press both of them, and a lot of the time you need to be able to press both of them at the same time as other things. So I wouldn't recommend putting this somewhere that's hard to reach, but F, E, and R could be any of these two. So this could be E, this could be R, this could be F, this could be R, right? All these could be F, E, or R. And then your sparing ones you're going to put on other things. So text chat, pirate wheel of emotions, not super important. Push to talk, I would say, is a little bit important in PvP. Sometimes it's helpful, especially if you're in your own crew and you don't have Discord or Xbox Party open. You might want to be able to push to talk. But also for communicating with other crews in-game, it can be helpful to have a push-to-talk bound. And I like to be able to press this without having to sacrifice my movement keys, so I have it on my thumb mouse button. So I have two thumb mouse buttons, and this is on the front one, the one closest to the monitor. Primary use and secondary use, they're going to stay on default. Quest Radial, Pirate Chat, and Quest Radial again, these are all just defaults. Actually, Pirate Chat's on R because I switched to E for secondary. This could be F, E, or R, but it's basically something that you don't need all the time, but I just put it on a button that I don't press. Stow/drop is a weird one. This allows you to loot sprint a lot easier if you put it on something else, and also when I fire my gun, it helps me cancel the reload time. Cycle weapons, I can understand if you want to put this on a button, but I prefer having this on mouse scroll up so I don't have to take my fingers off of a movement key to cycle weapons. I've seen people use weapon 1 as mouse scroll up and weapon 2 as mouse scroll down, and I'm sure that's fine as well. But right now I'm fine with just using 1 and 2 because I rarely use this unless I really need to pull out blunderbuss, and then I'll use 1. But I usually will just scroll. These are all defaults except for harpoon reeling lock, which you need to set to your secondary interact. These are all also defaults. There can be a conflict with right or break because I have that as my secondary interact, but I rarely find that comes up. This is not a super important bind, zoom in and out. This is where it starts getting important. You want to be able to bucket quickly, so I would recommend not having to pull out from your quest radial every time you want to bucket. So I have bucket bound to V. Cannonball can be important sometimes if you need to pull it out, but it's easy to get it out of quest radial as well. So quest and item radial. The compass, not super important, but it's still reachable at 7. I have to move my hands off my keys though. Fishing rod, not super important. Food, super important. Now you'll notice this on X, which is normally your stow/drop bind by default, but I've actually just swapped the 2. Well, not swapped the 2, but I've moved food off of 3 instead for X, so I can quickly tap X. Some people find it fine to press 3, and that's fine if you want to take your finger off W for 3, but I like using my D key finger for X, or my thumb if I really need to, but it's not super rushed if I'm just using that D key finger. Instrument, also not super important. Lantern is helpful in PvE, that's why I have it on 4, but in PvP, this doesn't matter. Pocket watch also doesn't really matter in PvP. Shovel, used to a little bit in arena, but for the most part, this doesn't really matter. Speaking trumpet, if you're trying to talk to the enemy team or just the enemy team, because it's never going to need it to talk to your own crewmates because they can all hear you. But I still have it on 5, which is somewhat accessible. Spyglass 6, this can be helpful as well if you're trying to see the other boat's ship name or player names from their banner. Tankard, not important. Throwables, this is an important one. So throwables, you need to be able to get out quickly in PvP because you want to throw throwables at your enemy. So I have that on C, so I don't know what I rebound for that, but it's a helpful bind there that I can just move my D key down to. But my X, my C, and my V are all very easily accessible. And then B as well, the 4th one on that row, which is also accessible by thumb. So when I pull out a bucket, I use V with my thumb off of my spacebar, and when I pull out a piece of wood, I hit B. Slot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, not super important. Throwables in the radial, this you generally don't want to be going to. I would just leave these as default because ideally you don't want to use the quest radial for the most part. So I would just leave these on defaults. Pirate chat, once again, unless you need to talk with this, which I wouldn't recommend, you should use your voice if you're trying to communicate. If you do need to use these, you could find it easy to switch, but I find that when I do use it, which is mostly for a joke, these buttons are fine. Toggle HUD, not necessary, but I have it on 0 because I stream and sometimes it's helpful to toggle your HUD off. Same with this, I replace gamer tags at 9 and this one at 8. Toggle mute all other crews voice chat. This can be helpful if you're streaming, but not essential. And I generally don't use ship nautical narration. Moving on to the next section, skipping controller, we're going to input. This is mainly controller and mouse stuff. I don't recommend any of this, but if it's something that you're used to, then I'm sure it's fine. I use quite a low sensitivity with 800 DPI and a 1.1 in game, which means that I use more of my arm to aim rather than my wrist, so I can be a little bit more precise. But for games like Sea of Thieves, it's not super important, even in the PvP, because there's wide hitboxes, and you'll probably just get hit regged anyway. Then these I bump up all the way to the top, because otherwise it's way too low. This is all controller binding, so I don't know what these should be, because I play keyboard and mouse. I have disabled controller input on PC on, because I don't use a controller, but it's also not necessary. And escape is back, I have off. Onto gameplay. In input, I have reduce hold to interact on. Now this is an interesting one, because you don't really need this on, but it can be helpful. So I used to play with this off for like about 2,000 hours of my gameplay. And then I played with someone who told me it was really good, so I tried it for one day, and I've never gone back. The reason this is helpful is because I'm able to load a cannon while moving around with WASD without having to think about it, because I can just tap E once. And this also helps with if I'm pulling from a storage crate or emptying a storage crate, it can be really helpful to just tab out and do whatever I want while I'm just loading a storage crate in game. Reduce hold to use item, I definitely don't recommend this. There are some people that play with toggle ADS on, which is basically what this does, which means if you scope in, it'll hold it scoped in, not recommended. Disable ship sitting and ship trinket interactions. In terms of PvP, these are not very helpful. These are largely cosmetic, but it's easy to just tab into gameplay and turn these back off if you do need to use your trinket interactions or if you do need to sit on a boat. But for the most part, this isn't helpful in PvP, so I like to turn them off so they don't, so I'll turn this setting on, which turns the interaction points off, because otherwise I can get stuck in a sitting emote when I'm not trying to sit, or I can get stuck in a trinket selection menu when I'm not trying to select a trinket. Auto center camera, that should be off. Vibration intensity, I mean, I'm not a controller user, but I imagine that might just be really good to have on 0 so it doesn't move your hands, but I don't know. Automatically float in water, I would say off. Tall tales on map table, if you're trying to do tall tales, I'd turn it on, otherwise I leave it off so I can see my map. Auto vote on voyage proposal is helpful because when you drop a voyage down, you probably want to vote for it, so I just have that on because whenever I put a voyage down, I'm voting on it. Unread tutorial prompt animations, not important, but I have that on. Alright, HUD. Toggle HUD on, obviously. Toggle radio manuals, I have this off, but I think this is generally not useful. Like, if I open a radial menu by accident, I can at least just let go of the button. But if you accidentally have this on and I tap Q, it'll stay open until I tap Q again, not helpful. Sticky radial items, this is helpful when you release, so you don't have to click on each thing in the radial. Fixed position, now this is something that a lot of people use. It can be helpful if you're trying to see a prompt that you can't normally see, but I generally have this off so I know when I'm able to interact with something without having to look at the bottom of my screen, because it'll put it all on the bottom. Recenter mouse and menus, I have this on. This is really helpful for getting stuff out of barrels because you always know where your mouse is. Circular navigation I have off. This is all just menu stuff, so that could be fine to keep on. That's personal preference. Banners are really helpful to have off because that way you can see your health bar all the time. I would recommend having everything off, or if you have to have it on, I would say put it on slimline. Now, not all of these have slimline. Island Banners does, but if you have this on cinematic, it covers your health and it covers your ammo whenever you get to an island. So I'd say keep that on slimline at most, but just off really, because you don't need to know what island you're at. Even for PvE, I generally just learnt them by looking at the map and going to them. Hide gamer tags and ship names from me. This is streaming stuff, can be helpful, but not really helpful if terms of just sweaty PvP. And it's honestly a bit easier to know who you're finding by their gamer tag, so you can judge their skill level. Nameplates by my crewmates, I recommend this on because then you can see where your crew are. Above the crews, also pretty helpful to know where they are because sometimes that'll pop up before their player model. Above fish is not really a PvP thing, but you might want to catch fish, and this helps you see what fish you're catching. Crew status tags on, so you know what your crew's doing if they're not comming it. Hide my gamer tag on banners. I have this on so that people don't play differently against me when they know they're playing me in a game, because you're your banner comes up and it says my name on it, but instead it'll say a streamer name. Hide my ship name for others. Same, I can have this on, but I like my ship names and I want people to see my cool ship names. I'm not the most creative guy, but I'm proud of them. Disable season notifications. I generally finish my season plunder pass in like the first week it's out because I play so much, so I don't find it helpful to see these notifications. If you do want to see these notifications, sure, but it can take up a lot of your screen. Pirate milestone notifications. Now, you might notice these are both off. Every time you launch your game, at least right now, this turns back to off. But I would recommend having these both on, but you have to go back and change it every single time. At the end of the day, it's not a huge issue, but it can be annoying because it blocks your screen every time you do some small action like sail a couple nautical miles, right? Onto video settings. My full screen resolution is a little bit lower than my actual monitor resolution. That just helps because it boosts my FPS a little bit because I'm on 4K and I don't need to see 4K and I'm only recording in 1080p. So I just have it 1440p. Just so it still looks a little bit nice, but it's still good. The other way of doing this is leaving it at native and going to resolution scaling and just bumping that down a little bit. That can really boost your FPS. Now, the trade-off, of course, is it looks a little bit more blurry, your game, and maybe you can see a couple pixels, but it comes down to preference. Display mode is full screen for me, just because better FPS, and I'm focused on the game when I'm playing it. I don't need to see the rest of my desktop while I'm playing a game. VSync I have off. I don't actually know how Sea of Thieves handles inputs the same way other games do, where it's better to have a higher FPS in some games so your inputs are registered more quickly. But in terms of VSync being on or off, that can come down to personal performance and preference, but in general I recommend leaving VSync off, unless you're having a really dodgy gameplay where your frame rate goes up and down or you get bad screen tearing. Brightness I have slightly up, but if I go into fog, it can be helpful to turn it down so you can see better. And if you go into the dark, it can be helpful to turn it slightly up. Same with color contrast. This is one of those things that is a bit more personal preference, but I don't mind just the default. Some people just bump it up like 5 and the game looks a little bit more vibrant. Frame rate lock. Now this is a fine thing to have on, but I generally just like to allow my FPS to go really high because sometimes it'll drop low. I have a pretty powerful computer, so it'll only generally go down as low as 50 or 60. But if you do have a problem where your FPS is going up and down all the time, I would recommend just locking it at a reasonable frame rate. Performance counters, I like having my FPS and ping so I can see them. They're at the top left here. So I can see if I'm lagging out, which is my ping if it gets really high, and if my game is lagging out, which is when if my frames are lagging out, sort of performance-wise, my FPS will drop really low, so I want that really high. Buffering, this can create a bit more consistency, but it can create input lag, and I find input lag can be a bit of a problem if you're trying to play quickly or fast, especially in PvP. Now, resolution scaling can be really helpful if you're having performance issues and your frames are really low. If you put this really low down, your game will look a lot worse, believe me, but it will perform a lot better because it's a much lower load on your GPU, right? Because it doesn't have to render as many pixels. Well, I think it might actually have to render as many pixels, but it doesn't. It downscales. I don't know. I would recommend putting this down to 90 and then seeing how it feels, putting it down to 80, seeing how it feels, unless your performance is completely fine, then I wouldn't bother touching this at all. Some people even put it higher up because they like seeing their game look really sharp. Auto skip intro animatic, I recommend having this on, that way when I launch the game, especially if it crashes, because the sod crashes sometimes, I don't have to watch the whole intro or skip the intro manually, it just automatically skips it. Auto graphics settings, field of view, 90. This is like non-negotiable. I would not play at 60, right? Let's just look at the game at 60. I'm super zoomed in. I'm looking at this part of it. Let's say I'm at the wheel. I can hardly see anything. I can see to the left and right. I can see boats. Right now it only goes to 90, and I wouldn't recommend using alternative programs because you'll just get banned. And a lot of people consider that cheating. So I'd recommend just leaving your FOV at 90, bumping it all the way up. Now this is the fun part, which is graphics settings. When it comes to graphics settings, it is a personal preference thing, but there are also some really helpful parts to it. I'm going to give you a couple options. What I'm on right now is what I would say is the highest you should go unless you've got a good computer, like a really good computer. Because I've just got default quality section of rare here. So with rare, I get a pretty nice looking game, But it's not mythical, but I can hardly tell the difference. Now, yes, if I went and just bumped it up to mythical, it would look nicer. But for me, it's not worth dropping to 80 frames or in a bad situation at like Thieves Haven or a big island, potentially dropping to like 40 FPS for me. Now, I have a pretty good computer, but I'd rather just have a nice high frame rate at a mid-level graphics setting. And a mid-level graphics setting in Sea of Thieves, which is a very, very pretty game, I find is completely fine. Now, if you have a really bad PC, and there's nothing wrong with gaming on a bad PC, I would recommend just bumping this down all the way to Cursed, but I would recommend having model detail on Rare. Now that just allows you, sorry, let me bump these down as well. That just allows you to see things at the maximum range. So when you go above Rare, the render distance doesn't change. So if I'm looking at a player who's 1,000 meters away, they probably don't render in. Maybe 500, I think-ish, they render in. I don't know the number. But at Rare, they load in at, say, 500. At Common, they'll probably load in at like 300, and at Cursor, probably like 100, right? So I want to get that as high as possible. But if I'm at Rare and it's 500, and I go up to, what's even next? Legendary, it doesn't change the distance, right? So I'd say Rare is the best for model detail, I would say, preference-wise, especially if you're on a low-end PC. But if you still can't handle that performance-wise, I would bump this down to Cursed. Now, the next level of graphics that I would recommend is bumping texture detail up, because when you look at menus, when your texture detail is on Cursed, the picture quality is really bad. So when you're in your tab menu, each picture can just be a really low resolution picture. It's not nice to look at. And this is a pretty good setting that I would recommend to anyone on a bad PC. This is what you're looking at right here. This will create a little bit of flickering, however. With shadow detail at Cursed and lighting detail at Cursed, your game will sort of flicker in and out. What I would recommend, if that's something you don't like, I would bump these two up to Common. That stops the flickering, especially when you're under the water queuing for a game in Hourglass. This stops that flickering by bumping it up to Common. And then the next step up is if you like your water to look nice, Rare, right? So Common and Cursed looks pretty much the same for water, but then Rare and above also looks pretty much the same for water as well. So I would say these three can bump up to Rare, these two on Common, and then pretty much for every setting, leave these at Cursed. Because even by default, if I bump up to Rare, these ones just stay on Cursed. So that's the main graphics settings. If we scroll down a little further, here's a couple more preference things. Disable blur, I would say on. It lets you see a bit faster, and I think it does help with your rendering in your GPU. Disable screen shake, that without a doubt is on for me, because I don't want to shake my cannon, so I can actually look where my bullets are going, my cannonballs are going, so I can see where they're landing and how I can aim better. But shaking makes it a lot harder to focus on that. Disable rats on your ship. I have this on, but it can be helpful if you're a newer player and you don't know the sound that the water makes as it gets to a certain level in your boat. When your water reaches about 50% full in your boat, you'll hear a creaking sound that's very noticeable. It's a louder one. And having disable rats on your ship off means that there'll be a little rat that'll run up top and you can see it up the top of your boat if the water blocks it. So if the rats, let's say we're on a galleon, if the rat's on the bottom floor, then that means there's no water. If the rat's on the middle floor, that means there's some water in the bottom floor. And if the rat's on the top, that means there's water in the second floor and you need to go bucket, basically. But I don't need that, I just listen to the sounds instead, and I just leave this on disabled, which is on. Color blindness filters, obviously if you're colorblind, this is a good setting for you. Some people like to leave, I think, green-red on because it makes the game look a little bit more vibrant, and that's a preference thing. You adjust the intensity of this with, color blindness filter strength, and then your saturation is just the brightness and darkness of the game. I prefer this at 1.0, but once again, that's a personal preference thing. High contrast X marks the spot can be helpful in some PvP situations, but mostly PvE. Just makes it a lot easier to find something on a map if it's a white X rather than a red X, which looks a little bit harder to see near red bushes, right? Audio settings. It's important that you have your sound effects high. Music, I wouldn't recommend turning this all the way off, because it's still helpful to be able to hear parts of the game so that you know when something's happening, right? If I'm getting attacked by a Meg, I'll hear a music volume, and then I know that there's a Meg coming, and that can affect PvP situations if there's a Meg in a PvP fight. Same with skelly ships as well, right? It also helps to know when you're diving. Master volume, this is preference stuff. Shanty volume, not super important. I just like to hear it. And obviously sound effects at the highest. You can handle it. Audio output mode, headphones, speakers and headphones, it's kind of a preference thing. It's complicated to how this works. No one fully understands it. But from my experience, turning this to speakers hasn't really helped me, and spatial sound has made it worse, in my opinion. Crew chat volume, I have this at 60 because I usually just listen to my crewmates through Discord. But you can turn this up and down depending on how loud your crewmates are. I just have that on speakers. Prox chat volume, I like having this a little bit higher because if someone else in the enemy team is talking, I want to be able to hear what they're saying so that I can find them, because it's directional. Which is why prox chat here is set to directional, so I can find them. Push to talk I have set on hold, so I don't accidentally leave it on and comm information to the enemy. And also because it's just useful to be able to press and hold a button and know that you're talking, you're broadcasting in game. Player chat indicator, also another indicator that I'm talking in game, so I know. Mute copyrighted audio, this is helpful if you're streaming and there's copyrighted audio and you don't want that playing through your stream. Audio output to mono, don't recommend this. Additional wheel turning sounds just means that you'll hear a couple more sounds when you're turning the wheel. Normally there's just the one in the middle for when the wheel is in the middle, but this one gives you some extra sounds, I think, every certain interval of the wheel. And I just have this rather quiet, but it is there in the back of my head, so I know. And musical hit notification volume, I recommend having this at least audible because you know when you've hit a boat. Because sometimes seeing it splash on a boat doesn't actually mean anything. Like right now, at least in the state of the game, if I hit a mast with a cannonball or a chain shot, if I don't hear the music, it means that that cannonball or chain shot didn't work. It just means that something went wrong on the server, and when I hit the boat with a cannonball or a chain shot, it didn't deal damage. So I recommend having this on because when you hear it, it usually means it does damage. There's some occasions where that isn't true, but in general, this is the general. You want to have this high so you can tell when you do a hit. Extend audio range of sea rocks while sailing, I have this off because I already don't like hearing the sea rocks while sailing. There's no audio setting for it right now, so I just have this off. Language, game language English for me. Preference obviously. Text chat and menus off. Text to speech override I have enabled. This just means that when I say something, it'll read it out to other people, whether they like it or not. Voice playback rate, just default. Speech to text override, I have enabled. So this means that when other people are talking, it's going to transcribe it into my chat. Now this means that if I didn't hear them because they're really far away, I can still get text in my thing that says someone's talking and I know, oh, someone's close. Transcription override not overridden. Translate other players on. This rarely works, but it can be helpful if you're playing, if other server people are on your server that aren't speaking your language, it'll automatically translate. Narrate toast message I have off. Toast message duration I have on 1. Narrate stuff I have off. Text chat scale is a little helpful if your text is too big on your screen. You can turn it down. I've only turned it down to 0.6, but it gets really low. It gets all the way to 0.5, and it also scales up to 1.5. So I'm going to leave it back on where I had it. Cool. Disable centered text. It's a preference thing. I recommend it just on off. And line spacing I have off. Nautical narration mode, continuous compass narration delay. This is all narration stuff if you're, I think if you can't see as well, or I'm not 100% sure because I don't use this. It's not really super helpful for PvP. Gameplay narration, interaction text, or just narration stuff if you need to be able to hear stuff extra. And that's about it for the whole guide. I'd recommend fiddling around with these settings a little bit, especially your keybinds, because it takes a little bit of getting used to, but I find that at least after a day of playing with settings, I know if they're good or not, because I've used them enough. So I'd recommend putting all these settings on that you liked, no pressure to use all of them, and then playing some Hourglass games and seeing how you go, and then changing whatever you didn't like. Thank you for watching. I do have some other guides that I can recommend to you. Obviously. I hope you had fun. I hope you've got some good settings now. Have a lovely day.